delighted to have Jeanette Schnars to talk to us. She's the executive director of the Regional Science Consortium in Erie, Pennsylvania, and is here to talk to us today about Lake Erie and other things. Her education is a BS in biology from Penn State, an MA in biology from SUNY Buffalo, and a PhD in wildlife and fisheries science from Penn State University. Her current areas of scientific interest are water quality issues of Lake Erie and the evolution of pollutants and their impacts to the ecology of the lake. And she's well connected to Chautauqua. She's been here for over 30 years and took classes here and met E.O. Wilson and Jane Goodall and has provided courses here in the summer. She's going to give you a good PowerPoint presentation, and we also want to note to the people out there in Zoom land, you can Zoom your questions in, and we will try to have those answered. And Larry was over here somewhere. He's in the back. He will come up and try to present the questions if you're Zooming them in. For the audience here, if you have questions after the talk, please go to the back microphone so that we tape all of our talks, and we like to have the questions and answers also taped. So without further ado, Dr. Jeanette Schnars. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me here today. I appreciate, the invite from Mark and being part of your group today. I am based out at the Tom Ridge Environmental Center. We are in the research wing, so my organization is the Regional Science Consortium, and the Tom Ridge Environmental Center, or TREC for the acronym, is right in Erie, Pennsylvania on the shores of Lake Erie, and we are at the gateway to Presque Isle State Park. And if you have not been to Presque Isle State Park before, it is a 3,200-acre peninsula. We have beaches on the lakeside, and then we have Presque Isle Bay, where there's a lot of recreation of boating, windsurfing, all kinds of things that happen out there. And Presque Isle State Park receives 4 million visitors a year, which is more than Yosemite, it's more than Yellowstone, so our largest national parks, we actually received more visitors. And then when COVID hit, everybody was encouraged to go outside to socialize, and so now we receive almost 5 million visitors a year. So it's a good thing, but it's also, quite a strain on the resource as well. And so what I wanted to talk about today was some of the work that I have done, but I'm going to go back in history. Some of the history you guys might be very, you might know very well, but just to do a quick review, and then talk about some of the research that I've done in, past projects, and then talk about what we are currently doing right now in terms of monitoring. All right, so the Great Lakes, as you can see from this aerial view, is made up of 5 different lakes. We are down in Lake Erie. That's where I'll kind of focus most of our talks. But the Great Lakes is this really important natural resource, and I think it gets overlooked often, but it is this freshwater resource that not only provides ecology, ecosystems, habitat, it provides fresh water that supports millions of people in our country as well as in Canada. And it also has resources like, a fishery that supports people that, use fishing for sustenance or even sport fishery, but it also supports a highway throughout the, connecting the Atlantic to the Midwest. So there's a lot of different functions behind the Great Lakes and a lot of different ways that it's been used over the years. And if we look at the Great Lakes and just do a comparison, you can see Lake Superior is our deepest of the Great Lakes. It's often considered the cleanest of the Great Lakes, and maybe that's because it's located all the way to the west and the water is flowing down through the connections down into the St. Lawrence River and out that St. Lawrence Seaway. But you can notice that Lake Erie is the shallowest of the Great Lakes. And with that, and it's also pretty much the most southern of the Great Lakes overall. And with that, we have a lot of productivity in those lakes, and we have the most diverse sport fishery of all of the Great Lakes. So the most different types of fishes that people can go fishing for as a sport fish and consume. So just getting that comparison of the different Great Lakes, the different, where they fall in terms of sea level, but also Lake Erie is this shallow, however, most productive of the Great Lakes. And with it being the most...
We'll be happy to comply and give you a bigger screen. So give generously.
All right. So like I was saying, with Lake Erie, even though it looks like it's the smallest and the shallowest, it's the most productive. And being that it is the most shallow, or it is the shallowest, one of the things that we have that is a real impact to the land in that area is we have coastal storm events, and we really need to look at coastal resilience of our area. So the shallower the lake is, the more wave action that comes. We have flooding in that area on the peninsula that comes out there. So, a big initiative of coastal storms and coastal resilience is not only in our ocean shorelines, but it is in our Great Lakes shorelines, especially Lake Erie. And so like I was mentioning, that Great Lake connectivity, so it's, this connection from the Atlantic Ocean all the way over to western Wisconsin, that shipping is an important part of what happens in the Great Lakes. And you can see through just kind of those orange lines and shading and pathways how the Great Lakes are connected. And that picture in the bottom is what's called a laker. So we have these huge ships that come through our area that are over 600 feet long, that are shipping goods, from across the Atlantic Ocean all the way over into the Great Lakes, and then throughout the Great Lakes and within the Great Lakes. There's a lot of shipping, a lot of commerce. And so one of the things that the Regional Science Consortium, or the RSC, also looks at is we work with marine archaeologists looking at shipwrecks. And so we have, just in our Pennsylvania waters of Lake Erie, we have a great many shipwrecks that are there. And in fact, we are in the process now of becoming a NOAA marine sanctuary. So in about a year and a half, we are in the designation process. That designation process will be complete. So in about a year and a half, that will be a national marine sanctuary because of those shipwrecks that are there. And, those go back to that historic, idea of being able to ship things throughout the Great Lakes. And also that idea of Lake Erie being that shallow Great Lakes that has a lot of significant storm events. And so we, the RSC has 4 buoys that we have out on the lake. We have 2 in our beach waters, which are close to the shoreline. And then we have 2 that are further out, about 50 feet deep, about 2.5 miles off the shoreline. And they're measuring all kinds of information. They have a full weather station on it. They have a water quality sonde, which is a series of probes that go in the water, measuring things like temperature and pH and dissolved oxygen and turbidity, and generate a lot of important information that we use in some of our modeling. And it also has a wave meter on it, so we can see, this is important to our commercial fishermen and our charter boat captains that go out on Lake Erie. It's important to know what the wave heights are. And it also has a video camera, so it has a live feed that is updated every hour. It's a 10-second video clip showing what lake conditions look like. Because the lake can be very different if the winds are coming out of the south compared to if they're coming out of the northwest. And a 2-foot wave is very different than a 4-foot wave. And so in a typical storm event, the waves are pretty significant, but I always ask people, what do you think was the highest wave we ever recorded on Lake Erie? And we've had those buoys out since 2014. So for the last 10 years, what do you think the tallest wave was that we ever recorded? 10 feet? Ooh, 26.5. So yeah. So if you imagine 100, 150 years ago being on a wooden fishing schooner out in Lake Erie when there was no weather service that was reporting what the weather was or giving you a forecast of what the weather was going to be, if you could imagine being on the deck of that ship and looking up at a 26.5-foot wall of water, I would think it would be very overwhelming and terrifying. And that really goes into this work that we are doing with our archaeologists to look at the shipwrecks that are in Lake Erie. And Lake Erie is, a dangerous lake in that respect. And so storms come up quick, and, a lot of these ships could not seek shelter or get to shore in time when the storm started coming in. And so this idea of shipping through the Great Lakes is very important, and you can see how going through that Lake Erie area could be very challenging, especially back, in historic times. And so as we get into all of these things happening on the Great Lakes and on Lake Erie, one of the significant things in the history of the Great Lakes is the Industrial Revolution. And I'm just going to kind of go over some important dates and significant things that happened that kind of lead into this idea of pollutants getting into our water. And so you have that initial Industrial Revolution, that first phase where buildings, things are being built. There is, waste that is coming out of these factories. A lot of times these factories are built along waterways, whether it's tributaries or streams or right along the lake shoreline, and a lot of that waste is just being discharged. And there was no real regulation back at that time. And then we get into that second Industrial Revolution, and we start kind of looking at the Great Lakes. So the early 1900s, there's a lot of things that start happening. And I'm just because it's probably hard for everybody to see the screen, I'm just gonna kind of go over this. I don't mean to read anything to anyone, but just so everybody can see it or hear it. In the early 1900s, so 1909, we had the inception of the International Joint Commission, the IJC. So now we have this working group that has people from the United States and from Canada that are really working together to think about, at least address and think about the water quality that are in these lakes that are shared. And then in 1913 to 1918, there is an IJC water quality assessment, and that primary focus was on bacterial contamination and not really the other chemicals that are coming out of the factories. But it's looking more at waste. And so this is before wastewater treatment plants that we have now that are much more sophisticated were online. So there's a lot of discharge that's just raw sewage going right into the waters. And then in 1918, the IJC has this water quality report that encourages, we need to start looking at what is being dumped in our water. This is becoming a real issue. As we get into the mid-1900s, then we see that pollution from the Industrial Revolution is degrading water quality. So it was happening early on, and then by the mid-1900s, it was like, oh, now we're seeing some impacts from this. Water quality is poor, the ecosystem is poor, the fishery is poor, maybe we should start thinking about how to address this. And then we have Canada and the United States form an advisory board and monitoring pollution that's focused on industrial and chemical pollution. And so, everything takes time, right? Decades later, we're getting a response. We need to do something about this. And then we have, around the 1950s, a pollution study focused on sewage, focused on chemical industrial pollutions. Also looking at contamination from channel dredging. So there is a lot of dredging that happens through the Great Lakes, especially in our shipping channels. And we'll see that those contaminants come into the water and they settle out into the sediment. To dredge the sediment is suspending all of those chemicals back into the water column, making them bioavailable to the different animals that live in the system. So when we finally kind of start addressing this and realizing what's going on, right around 1959, we see a decrease in pollutants discharged and construction of new water treatment plants for municipalities. So we can't just dump raw sewage in the water. And a colleague of mine that is now retired worked for the Erie Department of Health for many years, and we had tributaries that would go into Presque Isle Bay, which connects directly into Lake Erie, where those, you would see raw sewage after a storm just coming down, like all parts and pieces of raw sewage. And so again, this is something that really was not that long ago. And so new water treatment plants are not only being installed, but even in the last 50 years are being upgraded and more sophisticated. And then in the 60s, we have a document, the Safeguarding Boundary Water Quality document, outlining the progress that is made. And then in 1967, that is the historic poster child of the Great Lakes, where Lake Erie is declared dead. The Cuyahoga River is on fire. It is on fire multiple times. The fires might last 10 minutes, they might last a half hour, but it was over a dozen times that the Cuyahoga actually caught on fire. So these are all not only red flags, red banners that something needs to be done. We have progressed and abused this resource for almost a century, and so what are we gonna do? 1970, the EPA is formed, and the first Earth Day was observed. So all of this is kind of taking action that we see. We're seeing upgrades to sewage systems, which is great. The Detroit and Niagara rivers remain the most polluted areas of the Great Lakes, which is on either side of Lake Erie. And then we see in 1972, the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which is a binational policy on reducing phosphorus loadings and visible pollution. And phosphorus loadings, we'll see, are very critical. They were what was, you guys might remember, in detergents, however, worked really well to get stains out and your clothes clean. However, that all got discharged into the water, resulting in a lot of algal blooms that were detrimental to the ecology. Excuse me. In 1973, we see action on industrial pollution compliance and regulations that are being implemented. Keep in mind that a lot of these industries found that regulations, even if those regulations were not adhered to, it was cheaper to pay the fine than it was to pay for the upgrade or to pay for changing the product or the product that they were producing, making it less quality. So we still have that issue today or recently. And then in 1973, there is a signed international convention for the prevention of pollution from ships. So think back to all of those ships going through the Great Lakes. We have pollutants coming from them, whether it was discharging waste or oil or petroleum products or other things that were leaking from those ships. All right, so when we look at pollutants, we have organic pollutants and we have heavy metals. Those organic pollutants are things like PCBs, herbicides, insecticides, pharmaceuticals, detergents, fragrances, PAHs, which are our polysalicylic aromatic hydrocarbons, and then a lot of these organics are estrogen mimics. So that's something that we've heard a lot over the last 10 or 20 years, is these organic compounds have the same structure on the outside of the cell, these receptors that are not receptors, but these things that go into the receptors of other cells, where when they get into the human body thinks it's estrogen. The cells talk to each other, and that chemical has this form on the outside that looks like estrogen and tricks the body into thinking it's estrogen. So that's one of the very important parts about organic contaminants, is this estrogen mimic. And we see some of our smallmouth bass that exhibit both male and female reproductive cells in their bodies. And so the body is responding, that fish body is responding to that presence of what they think is estrogen, but it's not. So we have to really look at some of those organics. And PCBs, I'll talk a little bit more about my work with PCBs. Heavy metals, mercury, lead, arsenic, all of those heavy metals, very apparent in the Great Lakes. They are definitely in the sediments. That's why we have to really be very conscious of dredging. And if there is dredging, where does that dredge material go? Is it clean fill to use somewhere? Or is it contaminated fill that needs to be dealt with? And so dredging is something that takes a lot of permitting. There's a lot of hesitation with dredging. And, you know, sometimes in areas that are highly contaminated, it's almost better not to dredge, just to put a seal on it, right? And whatever is in that sediment, let it sink down and let it be and be contained. As you dredge, a lot of those contaminants get resuspended in the water. They become bioavailable to the fish and the plankton that are there, and they work their way into that food web. And so when we look at the food web, we're looking at the very basics. So you have your phytoplankton, which is your microscopic plant material. That helps feed the next layer, which is that zooplankton, which is the microscopic animal species that are in the water. But we also have a lot of macroinvertebrates that live in the sediment. And so before a lot of insects become that adult phase, they are a macroinvertebrate in the sediment or in kind of the bottom of the water column. And that's where they go through a lot of different stages of their life cycle. And then they have this emergence where they come out of the water and as an adult insect. But during that time, they feed a lot of different fishes, a lot of different animals that live in the water. So macroinvertebrates are an important indicator. They are important to the food web. We have certain macroinvertebrates we classify as pollution tolerant. So if we take a sediment sample and we have a lot of that type of pollution tolerant species of macroinvertebrates, then we can say, well, there's a lot of pollution in the water. It is an indicator of the pollution level of the water. If we have macroinvertebrates that are categorized as not pollution tolerant and we have a good diversity of those, then we can kind of gauge the water quality as being, you know, a little bit cleaner or having less pollutants in the system. So it allows us to compare relative to each other when we're looking at samples. So these little critters that live in the, you know, sediment, in the muck, in the bottom of our ponds and wetlands and bays and lakes are really important to indicate the bigger picture of what is going on in the whole aquatic ecosystem itself. And then keep in mind those contaminants can go from the sediment through these different layers all the way to that top predator, whether it's the fish that we are out there fishing and eating, those sport fish like yellow perch or walleye or trout, or if it is even beyond that, the predators that eat those fishes like different types of shorebirds, we can see that progress and biomagnify throughout the food web. So something that might be a very low concentration of contaminants, as it works its way through the food web and gets to that top predator, it biomagnifies to a much higher concentration, because if you think about it, each level is consuming a great deal of phytoplankton and then a great deal of zooplankton, and then, you know, so it works its way up the food web. Excuse me. And so in the 1980s, US EPA said we are going to develop these areas of concern, or AOCs. And these are areas identified as heavily contaminated areas. And so there were 43 areas identified, and this was a cooperative between the United States and Canada. And the water quality issues would impact humans and wildlife. So it impacted the whole ecosystem and, you know, the resource, the animals that use that resource as well. So Lake Erie, not Lake Erie itself where we are in Pennsylvania, but Presque Isle Bay, which is directly connected to Lake Erie, was identified as the 43rd area of concern. Now during the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, there was a focus on, if we were to clean up the Great Lakes, how much would it cost? Put a price tag on it. and it was over $300 billion. It was a lot of money. So this pushed into the next Obama administration, where they said, here's how we clean up the Great Lakes, here's the price tag. And the Obama administration implemented what is called the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or GLRI. So that came about in early 2000, and that had 5 different sections or categories, including water quality, that people could apply for funding. There was specific things that were being looked for, monitoring and research, and that it would all go into a larger database where other people could share those results and work off of those results. So some of the grant funding we received from GLRI really focused on bacterial contaminations in swimming beaches, because anywhere we have a swimming beach, we need to monitor the water. So Presque Isle Bay is that area inside that peninsula that you see there. So that peninsula that jets out from the shoreline of Pennsylvania is Presque Isle State Park. It's 3,200 acres. On the left side is Lake Erie. On the interior is Presque Isle Bay. And then if you look all the way out, that is where the shipping channel is, and that is where Lake Erie and Presque Isle Bay directly connect. And so it serves as a safe harbor for ships coming in, but it's a highly recreational area in the bay. And then on the lake side of the peninsula, we have several beaches. And those 5 million visitors that are coming to us every year are pretty much going to those beaches, a large portion of them. And so in 1991, Presque Isle Bay was listed as an AOC, and it was because of excessive nutrients like nitrate and phosphate, organic compounds, and heavy metals. So we had like the whole suite of contaminants or pollutants that we could get all in that little bay. Point source pollutions were identified as steel mills, foundries, water treatment plants, industrial facilities. Just outside of the bay, we also had a very large international paper plant. It was called Hammer Mill. It was there for over 100 years. At that shipping channel, we also had a coke plant that really generated a lot of pollution for over 100 years, and that is an example of it's cheaper to pay the fine than be compliant with regulations. That happened for a really long time, and there is a whole story behind that, but finally was shut down just a couple of years ago. And so then non-point sources of pollution are that combined sewer overflows and urban runoff. So a lot of our stormwater drains would combine, during big storm events, would combine with our sewer pipes that went through there. And so now you have raw sewage going right out into the bay during large storm events where you're getting a lot of water and getting a lot of volume through those stormwater drains. And so some of the updates that happened was wastewater collection, some of the separation of the sewer and the stormwater drains, and then we had our wastewater treatment plant that was upgraded as well. In 2013, we were the second one to be delisted, and so there was a lot of work that was done with our Pennsylvania DEP to monitor water. But the benchmark, or kind of the indicator species that was used, was the brown bullhead catfish. And if you can see that picture below, it's really hard to tell, but it's facing you head on. So you are looking like you're looking at my face, you're looking at that fish's face, but you can see all those different tumors around the mouth, kind of on the forehead. There is typically a lot of lesions on the liver and other organs. And so these fishes in Presque Isle Bay were an indicator, obviously, of really poor water quality and contaminants. And so that is very common. We pulled out a lot of brown bullhead. There's also yellow bullhead that looked just like this. There's brown, black, and yellow bullhead. The brown bullhead was was the indicator species that would lead to the delisting of the AOC. And so the idea was that these are benthic type fish. They like to be on the bottom. They like to root around in the sediment looking for those macroinvertebrates. And all of that constant contact with the sediment where all those contaminants kind of lie and get concentrated, they were constantly in contact with that, which theoretically is believed to have caused these tumors that affected them. So some of the work that, and a lot of what happened with the brown bullhead, those contaminants were probably heavy metals, but that's, really it was a suite of pollutants that probably led to those tumors. When we look at organic pollutants, some of the work that I focused on was with snapping turtles. And so I was looking at the maternal transfer of PCBs from a female to the eggs to the hatchlings. And if you were to go fishing on Lake Erie and get your fishing license, you would get a booklet that would tell you how many of each fish that you could eat per week, per month, per year because of the contaminant load in the fishes. And so you wouldn't want to eat more than, 6 walleye in a month because the contaminant load is so high that it could be detrimental to human health. You wouldn't want to eat a walleye that is over so many inches because it's too large and probably accumulated more contaminants over its lifetime. You shouldn't eat that. And so for walleye itself, it is 2 parts per billion of PCBs. That is that benchmark, like 2 parts per billion or over is where you do not want to consume that fish. When we did our work on snapping turtles, we would collect females, we would take samples of their fat and muscle tissue and look at the PCB loads or concentrations in those tissues. The fat tissue had, at our highest female, she had 204 parts per million PCBs in her tissue. So if you look at a walleye that you can't even eat because it has 2 parts per million, but then you look at this turtle that has 200, and the female looks completely, morphologically from the outside, she looks completely normal, she's not deformed. And keep in mind that reptiles, especially snapping turtles, have been around since the age of the dinosaurs, right? So they are these, historic animals that really have been resilient through all kinds of, environmental impacts over the years, including these pollutants. So she's carrying a really heavy load of pollutants, of, PCBs in particular. However, to be a pregnant female is really energy expensive. And so when she is producing those eggs, she's harvesting all kinds of energy from her fat bodies that is going into producing the eggs. And so a lot of those PCBs are getting kind of liberated from her tissue and going into the tissue of the eggs and the hatchlings themselves. Males, on the other hand, males carry that contaminant load through their entire life. They don't have any way of getting rid of those contaminants. So if you eat snapping turtle soup, you could ask, was it a female or a male? Maybe it'll make you feel better. But females at least have that mechanism to get rid of those contaminants. So now when we look at the hatchlings coming out and we, we analyze the concentration of PCBs in their fat bodies, we find that they are coming into this world with already a heavy contaminant load, and they haven't even experienced anything yet. I mean, they haven't even gotten into the water yet. They come out of the egg and they're already contaminated. So the idea or the thought here is that the contaminants that have gotten into our ecosystem, we always say like we have these chemicals that persist, these legacy contaminants that persist forever, thousands of years. Like the half-lives of some of these contaminants are over 1,000 years, and that's the half-life. And so when we look at this, we see that the adult, turtles are carrying a load, they're passing it on to their offspring. And PCBs have different reactions or different impacts to the physiology of the bodies of these hatchlings. And so interestingly enough, and this is definitely not in favor of contaminants, but PCBs can result in animals being hyperactive, a little like these bursts of energy, things like that. And so we started to test these hatchlings and compare. Do they seem a little more hyperactive than other, ones, like just relative to each other in terms of contaminant load? And, maybe that helped them get out of the nest cavity a little bit quicker, get to the water a little bit faster before some predator like a bird came down and ate them. So maybe it's giving them a competitive advantage. Maybe not, it's hard to say, but I think it's interesting to look at what are the impacts And it's hard to say, do they live longer, do they live shorter, because I would have to pass that research on to a next generation person because they do live so long. They live well over 45 years. However, I think what is really interesting is that when you look at before these hatchlings even come out, they're already contaminated, and it's not because of the soil they were in or the water that they were exposed to or anything like that. It's just the female, it's already, harboring those contaminants and passing them on. We do a lot of work on bacteria. So like I mentioned, any swimming waters that are in Pennsylvania or anywhere around the Great Lakes or even ocean beaches have to be monitored at least once a week by the US EPA for bacterial loads. So we look at E. coli, and that is the benchmark. If you were at an ocean beach, the bacterium would be Enterococcus. We actually analyze for both. I just believe if you're collecting a water sample, you analyze as much as you can from that water sample, and then have this master data sheet that you can make comparisons or kind of know as much of the story as possible from that water. E. coli is an indicator species. If we have really high levels, we do say we have an advisory or restriction. We say if you're older or very young or have a compromised immune system or open cut or wound, you should not go into the water because you're exposing yourself to this bacterium. However, the other thing that E. coli indicates is the presence of human waste. And there's other things that are transmitted via water from human waste, like hepatitis and cholera and the things that you hear about maybe in other countries that do not have really good water treatment systems like we do here and those regulations that we do here. So keep in mind, E. coli can make you very sick. For the most part of the levels we see, it might cause a stomach ache or gastrointestinal issues, things like that usually pass very quickly. It is hard for us to tell that exposure to the water resulted in people getting sick because most people take Pepto-Bismol or whatever and deal with it at home. They don't go to the doctor, and we can't see that cause and effect. We can't draw that line distinctly. So, but we do say that it is indicating, if it's very high, it's indicating other things can be in the water as well. EPA only mandates it once a week. Our park does a regulatory sample twice a week, but then the RSC, we're doing water samples every day during the 100 days of summer, which is Memorial Day till Labor Day. I have interns out there every day sampling water, and we're processing it for these bacteria. The interesting part is we collect the water, say, Monday morning. We bring it to our lab, which fortunately our lab is pretty much right on site. A lot of places that have swimming beaches have to send their water out and get it processed and get the results later. And you have to process them within 6 hours, so a lot of times those other places that send them out are not compliant with the standard methods. So we do it right on site. We filter the water, we put it on Petri dishes, and we just upgraded to a new system called IDEX, but essentially we filter the water on that filter paper, we put it on a Petri dish with nutrient media that is specific to grow E. coli or specific to grow Enterococcus, and then we have to put it in an incubator for 22 hours. So that one bacterium that we can't see will grow into a colony that we can see. And so those plates in the bottom picture have all of those colonies or dots that we can count, and then we can calculate how many colony-forming units per 100 milliliters of water, and then we can say if we are at an advisory level, a restriction level, or if we're at a safe level. The problem is the 22-hour incubation. I collected the water Monday. I have the results that I'm going to share with everybody on Tuesday. If there is a beach advisory, we're going to issue it on Tuesday, even though it's Monday's water. This is the standard methods of EPA. This is how it is done. Water moves fast. A lot of times by the next day, it has moved out and gone somewhere else. So that is the standard, affordable method that everybody can do. We also have predictive models. So we have so much data that we've collected over the years. We've been doing this since 2006. And we have been able to make 2 models, one with the US Geological Survey and one with Penn State University, where we can predict what those plate counts are going to be the day of. So we take a couple quick measurements, we collect the water. Turbidity is a really important one, as well as how far we are into the summer and temperature. And so we can predict what the plate counts will come out to be the next day. And that prediction, that model is pretty darn good. We are right hovering around 80% for both of our models. The one called Nowcast is with U.S. Geological Survey. The one called RoboHarry is with Penn State University, and that's in honor of the superintendent from our park that has retired. We also do observations. We go out there and look, and sometimes you're like, it is really stirred up. If you have a storm event, something like that, where the water looks like chocolate milk, you know, and it has that brown look to it, you are resuspending a lot of that sediment into the water column, and that sediment does have E. coli in it. But then qPCR is something that we have used a lot over the years. It can tell us pretty much day of, but by the end of the day, it takes, it's quite a process to do, but we are looking at the DNA in the water sample and saying it's E. coli. We even take it a step further on some of our previous projects because of previous funding, and we could say that it was from a cow, from a bird, from a human. And so that's, it's an important project that we've been working on for a long time. Our other water quality project, very important, is harmful algal blooms, which I'm sure if you're from around here at the Lake Chautauqua, you've heard of HABs. And so that is the aerial view of Lake Erie. You can see the western basin where Toledo is and Sandusky. They definitely have an issue with HABs. And a lot of that is because the Maumee River is this giant river that flows through a lot of land. There is a lot of runoff of agricultural runoff that has fertilizers in it. It's the nitrate and the phosphate from the fertilizer that is running into there. And with the sediment getting deposited, like all of that erosion coming down the Maumee River, that sediment gets deposited in the western basin, makes it very shallow, and it warms up a little bit quicker. So now you have this really warm water. You have a whole bunch of food in terms of nitrate and phosphate. The sunshine comes out, and we get these bloom events. And the thing is, Western Basin has a bloom event which really seems like once it starts, it goes through the whole summer. If you look at where we are at Presque Isle, that peninsula right there, we still get our own harmful algal blooms. They are not coming from the west and washing down to us. We have our own issue with harmful algal blooms like you can see here. That is on the park. It's that green, spilled paint looking, streaking. It can take on the color of green. It can look blue, it can look purple, it can look white. Typically it looks like this color here. And the reason I think that ours is, that we just have to keep monitoring ours throughout the whole summer, which we do every week, every Thursday we're monitoring for it, is because ours comes and goes. We have, you know, blooms at this site and then it dies back, and then we have it at this site. So it is a moving target, as opposed to the Western Basin where you can say, it's HAB season, stay out of the water. Keep in mind in 2014, Toledo had to shut their drinking water down because the toxins that HABs or harmful algal blooms produce can be skin toxins, neurotoxins, or liver toxins. And so it was elevated to such a level they had to shut down their drinking water. You could not boil your water because to boil the water just caused the cells to break open and release the toxins that were within the cells. So you just made it more contaminated. You could not shower or wash with the water because it is a skin toxin. It can cause rashes. So there's a lot of issues to harmful algal blooms, which are blue-green algae or cyanobacteria. That's a synonym, it's the same thing. But blue-green algae has been around since the beginning of time. That was part of like the first living organisms in the ocean. So they are supposed to be here. It's really how we treat the land and the amount of nitrates and phosphates that are getting into the water that are feeding these blue-green algae to a point where you get these bloom events. It's just out of control growth, and then the release of toxins. We monitor for 4 of those toxins, and everything we do is really geared off of grant funding. So some years we do all 4, some years we do this one every week, this one twice a week, this one once a month. But you know, these toxins do have an impact. Dogs are highly susceptible to these toxins, so when we test for them, the one nice thing is we can bring them back in the lab, we can collect the water samples, and we do the whole shoreline of Lake Erie. from the Ohio border to the New York border and all around Presque Isle Bay. We bring those water samples back. We're processing them in the lab that day. We have results by 4 o'clock that we are pushing out to our Department of Health and our DCNR that takes care of Presque Isle State Park. And then the next day, because we have to do a certain freeze-thaw method with the water, we release the results for the other 3 toxins as well. So in less than 24 hours, in less than 48 hours or 35 hours, we have results coming out. So it's by 4 o'clock Thursday and by noon the next day. And posting signage, such as the one in the red outline sign where it might say no dogs allowed or no humans, no swimming allowed. It is mostly we are exceeding at that dog threshold. Dogs are so susceptible at a very, very low concentration of these toxins. And so the results are that could be vomiting, seizures, and even death within hours. Depending on which toxin they are exposed to, within hours they can be very sick. Before you can get them to a vet, it can even result in fatalities. So we try to do as much as we can to get this information out as quickly as possible. We do a lot of education. We have our little HAB lab there that's being towed by the truck, which we go out and we just create awareness. The sky is not falling. It doesn't mean everything is a disaster. It means, hey, be aware, it's HAB season. This is happening, and don't bring your dog in the water because, you know, it's just not the time of year to do it. We also have a map that we update, and we also have a strategy that we developed and received the Governor's Award of Environmental Excellence for. I got 1 minute, right? Or am I done? I got 1 minute. Okay. Okay. So eutrophication, you guys might be aware of this, but when we have all of these nutrients, we have all of this algae, the algae dies off, the bacteria start to break it down. Our oxygen, dissolved oxygen levels go way down in the water column. It results in a lot of fish kills. And so it does have a progressive effect as well. One thing I'm gonna touch on super quick, pharmaceuticals in the water, that is a very current, in the last 10 years, it's really being monitored. So PPCPs, pharmaceuticals and personal care products, have a lot of different chemicals in them. And, you know, if you take medicine, you only absorb a certain portion of that medicine, and the rest of it goes out when through your urine or waste and flushes down the toilet and into the water. So what we are seeing is a lot of emerging contaminants out in the water. Some of the highest ones that we see in Lake Erie are antidepressant type drugs, anti-seizure drugs. Caffeine is a huge one. So we can tell if there is like human waste getting into the water by the amounts of caffeine in the water, because we're all guilty of caffeine, I think. But then there's other ones like ibuprofen, naxoprofen, triclosan. So when you go home, look at your soap that you have and see if it has triclosan in it. It is an antibacterial agent, but it is also an estrogen mimic. It's very bad for the water. So there are certain name brands that do have this. Don't buy that name brand anymore. I will say soap, by definition, is antibacterial, and so you don't have to add other chemicals to make that happen, but please try to be aware of that. And there's also a lot of estrogen in the water. So, you know, a lot of females with birth control injections or pills or whatever, a lot of it is not 100% absorbed by the body and comes out in waste. There's a lot of estrogen in the water. So the importance of water, it's really important. It is the basis of everything that we do, our food, our drinking water. So think about being part of the solution. I gave you like these huge problems we have, but really individually, we can all be part of doing something that helps, and added together, it's a synergistic effect. So just be aware of your water quality issues. Try to avoid some of those chemicals I mentioned. Fertilizer best management practices. Do not fertilize your lawn before a rainstorm where it gets, you know, just turns into runoff, but be very conservative with your fertilizing. Plant a rain garden, use a rain barrel, landscape with native plants. They take a lot less water and maintenance, and then help with things like marine debris cleanups. And I appreciate the extra minute, Bob. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Schnars. Again, the Zoom-in people are going to be represented by Larry, Dr. Rizzolo. You have any, you've got some? Go ahead, go for it. If you have a question, please come to the microphone and ask a question, and we'll try to get an answer for you. But we really don't need more speeches. We have enough in Chautauqua.
Okay, if you have a question, please speak directly into the mic so the people in Zoom can hear your question. Can you talk about aluminum sulfate that they used in Lake Chautauqua to address blue-green algae in New Hampshire?
That is not something I have direct experience with, but I work with colleagues that do treat ponds. I definitely would encourage that if you are, or small lakes, if you are part of a community that is housed on a small lake, there are treatments that you can do to control algal blooms, vegetation, but also think about as like a homeowner, or if you have a homeowners association, how can you take preventative measures to reduce the runoff into the water that would cause overgrowth of algae that would result in needing treatments like that. So those treatments are good. They help control something, help control that algal bloom, which can result into, like I said, low oxygen levels, fish kills, things like that. It can really degrade the ecosystem. So, yeah.
As a follow-up, if a community on the other side of Lake Chautauqua were to do such a thing, how would that affect our drinking water on this side of Lake Chautauqua?
That is a really good question, and the way I'm going to address it is if you look at the Great Lakes in the IJC, that was a cooperative effort between Canada and Lake Erie, and so being collaborative with everybody that lives on that shoreline and everybody that contributes to whatever the waste is or issue is, you are going to get much further ahead. It's always important to take care of drinking water. That's so essential because it's not only us, it's also the animals that live in there that are also being impacted even before we are. Like, they should be the indicator. They should be the canary in the gold mine. Like, if we're having issues here, or if you're taking water quality measurements, then we should do something before it impacts our drinking water. So I know I'm not gonna address that answer exactly, but I'm going to say that yes, everybody needs to be on the same page. Otherwise, if you're only having half of the people do it, you have a good impact, but you need everybody to be on board.
Okay, I have a comment for the chat. Even though I'm speaking directly in the mic, would you kindly repeat the question for the Zoom audience?
Okay.
Okay, and the last, before I give someone else a chance, is do you study microplastics?
So microplastics, I have a colleague that will also be a guest speaker as part of this series. She is an expert in microplastics. We are very conscious of it. We collaborate with people that do that. We are actually launching an initiative that will come about in 2025. That is the Lake Friendly Initiative. We are going to work with small businesses to reduce the use of single-use plastics and shrink wrap on boats, because living here, we have to take our boats out of the water, we have to put shrink wrap on them so we can overwinter them. And so recycling that shrink wrap and reducing the plastic usage will qualify them as this lake-friendly business and will be part of a marketing campaign. And if you look at other ocean, beach towns, things like that, you might see, restaurants say, oh, we don't do plastic straws, or oh, we don't do that because we live on the lake and we love our lake and we are showing our support. And so I think that community initiative, that community support is very important. Serve as the example and then really ride that momentum. And that's something we're launching in 2025. And so we will be working with that person as well, and it will result in a reduction of microplastics.
We're advised to eat more fish to be healthy. When we've come up here, we have discovered that the Lake Erie perch is a great tasting fish that's not available anyplace else. Are there risks of overfishing the Lake Erie perch? And I salute the people up here for not marketing it to New York City and Washington, D.C. and flying it around the world.
Our people love yellow perch. That is a really important part of our sport fishery. It's also a fish that naturally reproduces in the lake, so we don't need hatcheries for it. We don't need to, try to make more of them to put out in the lake so people can catch them. There has been a lower or decline in yellow perch fishing, angling, not necessarily, some of the population, but really the catch of yellow perch. And a study that we did a handful of years ago, an invasive species called the spiny water flea. It's only that big, it's very translucent, and it has a black eye to it, so that's about all you can see. It'll get on your fishing line. The yellow perch, all they have to do is like open their mouth, and there are so many of these spiny water fleas, they just go through like a buffet. And then they get so satiated, they're so full, that if I'm fishing with a minnow, why are they gonna chase this minnow and expend that energy when they can just eat these spiny water fleas? So what, future studies, what we wanna look at is the nutritional value, because we are anticipating the nutritional value of spiny water fleas is very low. We kind of joke around and say it's like eating potato chips, it's not really good for you. We're seeing that might actually impact their fecundity or reproductive, their offspring in future years. All of that is still unknown, but is suspected, and we'd like to look into that more. But there were years that we had charter boats go out of business because they would take people out perch fishing. The perch are in the water. You can see it on the fish finder, but they couldn't be caught. And so the couple that we could catch, when you'd pull them up, you just had to like squish their belly a little bit, and it was just masses of spiny water fleas that were being regurgitated. And so yellow perch is really important, but it's being impacted by this invasive species being present. However, the walleye fishing is off the charts the last couple of years. So that fishery is really in a boom right now and tastes almost as good as yellow perch. Almost, it's real close.
Hi, I'm from the Toledo area, and you didn't mention something we hear about all the time when it comes to harmful algal blooms, and that's called CAFOs, Confined Animal Feeding Operations. And it's been reported that we have so many of these mega farms in our area that they produce more manure, the animals do, than the people do in the Los Angeles metropolitan area. And the contention is a lot of this waste is coming in heavy rain events, is getting into the Maumee River and getting into Lake Erie, and it's helping the bloom. So do you research CAFOs at all?
All right, so summarize the question. A lot of issues here with manure, kind of runoff from manure impacting harmful algal blooms. And we don't necessarily look at specifically manure. We look at the nitrate and phosphate nutrients in the water, those concentrations, which come from manure. They come from fertilizers. And for instance, our conservation district has a manure management program that agriculture farmers can go through, but there has to be a management program because you get a storm event and it runs off, and all of that is contaminating your water, one, with bacteria like E. coli, for sure, but then also the nutrients that is found in manure, like the nitrates and phosphates. So that is something that needs to be managed by those farmers or people that have a lot of livestock and are generating a lot of manure, because it does have a direct impact to harmful algal blooms. It does definitely kind of feed the beast, it's providing those nutrients.
And as a follow-up, I know you're a Pennsylvania official, not an Ohio official, but do you have an opinion on Governor DeWine, that's Ohio Governor DeWine's water quality program, which is basically asking farmers to do the right thing, which they don't?
That is an interesting question, and I am not good with politics, so I will avoid that question. But I will say, I will make mention that the Ohio Sea Grant, where Western Basin, that does have a very distinct harmful algal bloom program, Ohio Sea Grant has really invested a lot of time and effort in working with their elected officials and bringing in farmers from large farms to be aware and to try to make changes to sustain the quality of the water. So I think there is some groups like Ohio Sea Grant that are really working on that initiative, and part of that is working with those elected officials to encourage those things to happen. And again, what we try to do is create a lot of education and awareness that this is affecting all of us. It's going to affect you in your business as well as us in our drinking water and your drinking, all of these things. But I would say there is some effort that is trying to be made there.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I have two quick comments and two related questions. Comment one is to thank you for what you do, because to have a science root in understanding this is so important. But my question is this. You mentioned PCR-based studies. Do you actually apply the PCR-based studies as well to...
I'll repeat it.
relative to harmful algal blooms and what drives them to create the cyanotoxins?
Yeah.
And then the related question is then, do you as well look at the effects then of these cyanotoxins on the other elements of the food chain?
That's a really good question. One, thank you for acknowledging the work we do, because everything we do is grant funded. So I beg, borrow, and steal money to make sure that we can monitor as much as we do and get those results out as fast as we can. That's very important to me. So I appreciate that. And then in terms of qPCR, when we are running the qPCR in relation to harmful algal blooms, we did do a study. We were working with a colleague over at Wilkes University, and she had worked at Woods Hole doing a similar project, but depending on what species of blue-green algae are kind of in the area at one time, it's really poorly understood why do certain species release toxins at certain times. And then some of them genetically do not have the ability to release toxins, So we could do we could send our samples out and have it genetically looked at, like, yes, they are toxin producing, or no, they're not. If they are, why do they release the toxins? Is it because there's these other species that are viewed as competitors or predators, or, why are they? And that's something that is still being understood. So yeah, we had a project that we were looking at, just sequence everything, blast it against GenBank. What do we have in here? What different species of microbes are in there that might be impacting, and then eventually model it, and then funding runs out.
Great.
But the thought is there. The thought is there. And then tell me the second question.
No, that was it.
Oh, okay.
You answered it. So my last comment is simply, I'm giving a shout out to what's called the Jefferson Project at Chautauqua Lake, where these kinds of studies are just really getting underway. And this whole question of circulation models is also important, because it says something about how things get brought up from sediment, as well as how things traverse from one point to the other. But thank you again.
Thank you. So yes, the mention of the Jefferson Project is phenomenal. And I will say something that they're doing is they're invested in Lake Chautauqua and collecting data. And it's always that question of how much data do you collect? More data, the better. Is that not always true? I will say that whether you're doing research or monitoring, in these projects, monitoring is so important. And nobody likes to fund monitoring because it's not an 18-month project or a 3-year project, right? And you can come out with results and say, this is what we found and these are the trends that we found. But monitoring is giving the community real-time information as fast as we can to make management decisions. And so monitoring is critical, and it's hard to convince funders of that, but we do our best, and we hope that the result is benefiting our community as well.
Thank you. I also applaud your critical work. It's so important. I assume because of the limit of time, you didn't get to talk about invasive species, which was a big part of Dan Egan's excellent book on the death and life of the Great Lakes. But invasive species, in that book, talked about how they get here through the ballast discharge of ocean-going ships. Can you just speak briefly on the update on any regulations?
Yeah, so the question is regarding invasive species in the Great Lakes and kind of how they got here through ballast water. And so if you look at these big ships that are coming from the Caspian Sea and over in Eastern Europe, coming through all through the Atlantic and then coming into the Great Lakes, as they are loading or unloading their cargo, they have this water in the hull of their ship that they are either bringing into the ship or they are dumping out. And so as they're dumping it out into the Great Lakes, that's how we got the zebra mussels and quagga mussels, because they come in as little microscopic things that get into the water. And then eventually the round goby came over, and then the tube-nosed goby. So all of these things that got transmitted because the water was sucked up one place and put in the ballast and brought over to us and dumped into the Great Lakes has caused a huge shift in the ecology and the animals and how they respond and how they live here. So we see like certain fishes are starting to eat round gobies. We see zebra mussels and quagga mussels, which look almost identical. They are actually sequestering toxins from the harmful algal blooms, just like you see in Florida when they have the shellfish that you can't eat because of saxitoxin, which is one of the toxins from harmful algal blooms. It is the same idea here. They are sequestering it and it's getting in the tissues, and then you see that bass are eating those mussels and they are getting the toxins into their bodies as well. And so invasive species has really changed the ecology, and as we see climate change or the changing climate where it's getting warmer up here for a longer period of time, we're going to see species that don't normally live here being able to survive here longer, or we're going to see the home range of animals that live in the south start to push towards the north, and that is also going to change our ecology. If you get a chance, when you get back to your computers, if you Google Asian carp and look at those fishes coming up the Mississippi, that is, so in Chicago, or outside of Chicago, is 3 electrified dams. However, if you look in the Mississippi River of boats going through and the electricity from their motor kind of being picked up in the water by these fishes, it causes them to jump out of the water, and these are big fishes. And so, people that are going quickly on their boat kind of, going through the water, these fishes are jumping out like popcorn all over the place. People have gotten broken noses. They've gotten black eyes. I mean, they've been injured from these things. But it is really thought of or theorized that if these fishes get through those electrified dams and get into the Great Lakes, they will decimate all of the fishes, all of the native habitat. If you think of all our sport fishes in Lake Erie that we rely on in terms of economy, that we have refugee populations that rely on it for sustenance, that is going to be a huge issue, but it's an impressive YouTube videos if you get a chance.
We're going to have to stop pretty soon. So could the last 2 people just ask your questions in succession and then try to answer the 2 questions, and then we'll call it.
I'm curious about the organization. Are you public, private, government? How does it all come together in a regional consortium? Thank you.
Thank you.
What public policy changes are you working towards, and who are you collaborating with on those?
Okay, thank you. So my organization is the Regional Science Consortium. We are a nonprofit. We have a membership or a consortium. So our membership is colleges and universities, state and federal agencies, and other local government agencies, school districts. We do a lot of education. So everything I talk about, we bring in K through 12 students and we get them well versed on all of these things and a lot of experiential learning, and then other nonprofits. And so what we do is work with our members to, collaborate on these projects. And then different policies that we are working on, a lot of the data is funded through state agencies like DEP. We provide that to them and hope that they respond and develop some policies or help fuel the work that they're doing in terms of policies and make changes for the better. But our strategies that we've worked on with these state agencies, like our HAB strategy, is something that has been going on for several years. And so, yes, we collaborate as much as possible and hope for change in the better. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Schnars. Next week, come back and hear Dr. Rob Brown. He's a radiologist who will talk about health effects of exposure to electromagnetic fields. Thanks again for coming, and a word.